Hey, new reading glasses. What do you think? Go grab a cup of coffee or a soda or something. So, pollution. That's really focus of the channel is pollution and many different vectors if you're into vector physics. That pollution can be introduced into life. So, there's conversations about a carbon tax going on right now. It's pretty specific. I mean, it's a good conversation because somewhere the you know the price has to be paid to do the right thing. If we find it out, if we find the right thing, right? So when the EPA did its work, and it had to, there was no choice. The Northeast would have been, if those plants back in that day, right? This is what, the 50s and 60s? Nixon did this. If those plants back in that day had not been checked, whole states, half of a state, half the state of New York, the upper part of the state of New Jersey, would have been chemically devastated. So something had to be done. It was no longer a choice. It was too obvious. The people that drove from New York and the East Coast down to Florida on vacation drove through this. They saw it. I mean, it was that northern part of New Jersey was chemical industry's workplace, making the things that we enjoy. So what happened inside of that legislation, right? Now, so the EPA got heralded and began watching and reporting on things, but underneath that were massive, massive tax incentives. Incentives from states and from the federal government to help move these industries because what they were doing was necessary. Arguably, different debate, but we wouldn't have Polaroid film if it wasn't for some of this. Yeah, Polaroid and Kodak were a part of the chemical side of some of these conversations because of the chemistry in photography, in film that's used for satellites, film that's used for infrared scanning, film that's used for looking for nuclear particles. Back in the old day, that's one of the ways it was done. It was film exposure to an area. And if there was a bunch of blips on that film that was uncovered to light, then guess what? That's how the photographic industry learned that they had to wrap their products in foil because foil easily stops alpha and beta radiation, which are probably the main concerns you should have in the radiation spectrum. So back to the largest move of chemical facilities. Now down in Texas, the chemical industry was already there because of both World War I and World War II and a quest for ultra-high purity materials to build all the machines, not just the war machine. It made the televisions, it made the radars, it made the airplanes, it made the electricity grid, that engineering, that the science that was handed to engineering to go apply. But in those moves from one state to another, the notion of pollution disappeared. Those new plants that were built were generations better than what was put in the Northeast cities. Those were the population centers of the time, major ones. And then Texas, down there up and coming, but a state very much built on the cost of war for all the heavy industry they've got down there. Anyway, back to this EPA. So all these industries moved, and inside of that were agreements to allow the states to regulate emissions based on federal guidelines. And the interpretation of those guidelines lets Flint drinking water be poisoned. The interpretation of those guidelines lets maybe some materials be released into the environment that shouldn't be because they're debatable, or they'll fight it out in court for decades. while the whatever still goes on. So in those moves, in those tax shifts, more subtle, it almost gave us incentive, it did give us incentive to shift manufacturing overseas or offshore. And by offshore, I mean right across the Mexican border. I saw a nasty smelting plant on the American side of the border picked up and moved to the Mexican side. So the chimney, the exhaust emissions from that smokestack moved few football fields across a river, and the wind was still blowing in the same direction. So there was a nuance of this. Somehow the company, well, not somehow, the company saved because of labor costs. Unions typically don't make those migrations very well. And equipment costs. To do it on the American side would have meant extra millions of dollars in emissions controls and environmental monitoring and a waste stream that had to be dealt with and another. So the requirements just keep adding up in this, those little pieces underneath of everything. But inside of that, there was discussion about pollution taxes, because basically we offshored our pollution to China. China is where we were industrially not many decades ago. China is suffering what LA suffered decades ago. India is suffering still. They have been. It never went away. It hasn't changed much. But so that's what was inside the EPA. We've incentivized things, and the people and the reasons we did this for are lost, and the profits rage on. There's a place for taxes. Peace out.